Hey, welcome back everyone. We're going to continue on with this reading, The Life of Jehoshua, the Prophet of Nazareth, by Dr. Franz Hartmann. This is Chapter 2, The True History of Christ, an Allegory. Forever the light shineth into darkness, but the darkness comprehendeth it not. Long ago in the past, perhaps millions of ages ago, at a time beyond human calculation, there was a realm of light, wherein resided the Spirit of wisdom. His body was like a sun, and the living rays emanating from him filled the universe with glory. Matter of a fiery and ethereal kind, such as is unknown to man, filled all space, and the light coming from that Spirit penetrated the realm of matter, and endowed it with life and sensation. Gradually, this matter began to cool. Centers of attractions were formed, and around these centers still more matter condensed, and they grew into revolving globes traveling with lightning velocity through space, being guided by the Spirit of wisdom. Upon these globes, stones, vegetables, animals, and human beings grew. I'm going to take a moment here to just add some commentary. If you've been following along with the other readings, and if you've been following the dry erase lessons that I posted last week, then you'll see what he's describing here. He's describing the beginnings, the first stirrings of our universe, and then the sun, that solar fire, which then began to interact with the darkness of space, and the waters got separated from the waters. That's steam and then precipitation, and eventually it formed the first piece of matter that we could call an actual piece of matter. I mean, the sun, the fire is also matter, obviously, but it's of a higher gradation. It's more subtle. So, anyway, let's continue. But in proportion as this matter became dense and solid, it became impenetrable to the light coming from the Spirit of wisdom, and the men born therein groped in darkness until they discovered a phosphorescent substance in the caves of the earth, which gave forth light like a diamond after having been exposed to the sun, and they called it ratio. By the light of this stone they were able to see their surroundings. Men and animals used this stone, but in the hands of men it shone brighter than when the animals used it. But the light which they now possessed threw a false glitter upon the objects which it illuminated, and caused them to appear distorted, and not as they actually were. The Spirit of wisdom, pitying mankind on account of their ignorance and darkness wherein they lived, resolved to descend to them, but being unable to make himself visible to men, because their eyes had become petrified and blind, he attempted to manifest himself by assuming a more solid shape in their souls. He entered the heart of man, and found it to be a stable filled with animals of all kinds. There was an ox called the will, tied to the yoke of passion, and an ass called reason, led by erroneous speculations. There was a hog called intemperance, and a goat called lechery, and around this door prowled the tiger, the wolf, and the hyena, seeking to gain admittance, while snakes and poisonous reptiles were wriggling and crawling through the cracks of the roof. The stable was full of impurities. The windows were covered with cobwebs that prevented the light from entering, but in spite of all these disgusting surroundings, the Spirit of wisdom remained there and attempted to clean it and transform it into a temple fit for him to reside therein. And obviously we're talking about the heart of man, which is, in one sense, the lower mind. Okay? We can split the brain into hemispheres, left and right side. We can split the brain into hemispheres going from top to bottom. Okay? We can draw a meridian on the brain or an equator, and we can separate it. And you also have higher and lower mind there. But when we're speaking of the body in particular, think of how these things will pertain. Think of wheels within wheels. So you can do the same thing to the entire body that you can do to the brain when you bisect it. When we're using the body as the whole, then the heart is a lower mind than the brain is. And the heart is also, as Max Heindel and Rudolf Steiner and people like Franz Hartmann, who are legitimate Rosicrucians, will tell you, is that the heart is off to the left side. We all know that, but there's an occult truth in that. It's off to the left side because it's still in sin. We're trying to center the heart. The heart's physically off to the left, slightly off to the sinful side, because we have not yet redeemed the heart. And that's the doctrine of Christ, to redeem the heart through love. Okay? It's also considered the lower mind. And there's an even lower mind than that. And we all know what that is if we go down the chain, right? The generative regions. But for the sake of this, we're talking about the heart. Let's continue. He attempted to make his presence known to the proprietor of the stable, but for a long time his calls were not listened to. For besides the noise made by the animals in the lower part of the building, there was a great noise made in the upper story, which was occupied by traders of all kinds, by lecturers and preachers, scientists, theologians and moralizers, of whom each one tried to make himself heard above the rest. By some accident, the voice of wisdom attracted at last the attention of the proprietor, but he could not understand what is said, for the language seemed foreign to him. He therefore sent a commission to examine the claims of that spirit. Sophistry and superstition, the daughters of ignorance, and a fellow named Logic, an illegitimate son of a woman called Experience, arrived, accompanied by a dog called Selfishness. They listened to the spirit and wrote down what he said. They then asked him for his certificates to prove who he was, and wanted to dispute with him. And as he did not answer their arguments in a manner comprehensible to them, they shook their heads and did not believe what he said. The animals clamored that the strange visitor should be ejected, for his presence disturbed them in their comfort and ease. Moreover, the angel, having begun to assume a material form, needed some nourishment to acquire substance and strength. And he abstracted blood from the animals in the stable and nourished himself with it. Such a state of affairs appeared intolerable to the proprietor of the house, and he resolved to kill the intruder. He was, however, afraid to attack him openly, because he feared the light that shone from his body. He had in his employ 2 servants in whom he trusted, although they were 2 thieves, who continually robbed their master of his most valuable treasures whenever an opportunity offered itself. But he knew it not, and believed them to be his faithful assistants. The name of one of these thieves was Credulity, and the name of the other was Skepticism, and both were the greatest enemies of the truth. Now think of what we've gone over previously in the previous books and in the dry erase board stuff. The 2 thieves. We know those 2 thieves as Lucifer and Jehovah in their negative aspect, or the right and left sides of the brain in their lower aspect, right? Their unrefined reason and their unrefined intuition. And remember how the story goes. Cain slew Abel. That is, that lower left type of logic overtaking the right imaginative and intuitive side of the brain. One evening, the spirit went into the garden that surrounded the house. He had succeeded in transforming, by his magic power, some of the animals into men, and they followed him. But the proprietor, hearing of his whereabouts, sent his servants to have him arrested. But credulity and skepticism had never seen the spirit of wisdom, and did not know him. They therefore applied to logic, who, by a certain trick of argumentation, which he had learned from a sorceress in the West, whose name was Curiosity, managed to come very near to the truth, and kissed him, and they then treacherously overpowered the spirit of wisdom, and caused him to be crucified. But the spirit, being immortal, could not die. The men who attempted to kill him merely destroyed his form, and thereby rendered themselves incapable of seeing his outward expression, and the spirit of wisdom returned to his eternal home, to descend again and again into the hearts of men, and to repeat the same process forever and ever, by being born, crucified, and resurrected every day. And that was a very short chapter, so we'll probably do another one right after. The next one's going to be on Jehovah, will be chapter 3. And it's very important to remember that each thing or character talked about has its lower and higher aspects. It's very common in Rosicrucian teachings to assign negative traits to Jehovah, of course, obviously, when speaking of those negative traits, the debased concepts of Jehovah, which, according to the esoteric philosophy, the original Hebrews who called their God Jehovah were actually worshiping a debased version or a debased idea of what the true YHVH was. Okay, if you go back in history, they actually took the name Jehovah from a pantheon of gods and chose Jehovah as their high god. But it was a very debased understanding, and that's why they struggled so much, because they weren't really truly embodying and looking up to the ideal of what YHVH truly means or meant back then. They just took him as their race god and kind of turned him into a monster. Okay, so that's just important to note, because it can be easy to mix those things up. There is like a true higher version of what we call Jehovah anyway, the YHVH. There's a higher understanding of that, and there's a lower understanding of that. Okay, and when you take any god and debase him and make him your personal god who's just only rooting for you and everyone else sucks, then you're not worshiping the real God. You've taken and debased ideas and applied them to yourselves and created a monster, essentially. Okay, so we'll get into that in the next chapter, but just wanted to note that. That's going to be all for now. Everybody take care, and we'll do another chapter here soon. All right. Talk to you later.